Sanbonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to episode 335 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. It's the Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the family. You are tuned in to the only daily property podcast in South Africa, and we help you on all your property needs. Doesn't matter where you are on your property journey, whether you're looking to buy, to sell, to build, or of course you're still, a tenant and want to get a better sense of how you can move from being a tenant to being a homeowner. This is where you can get all of your property questions answered. And to all our regular viewers on Facebook, on Instagram, as well as on YouTube, welcome back. You know how we do. Every single weekday, you and I have an appointment where I'm always in conversation with a property expert who helps us navigate our property journey. And of course, it's always a great one to also share our own experiences, because property is one of those things that's a team sport. If you want to go, very, very far, you want to work with people, you want to make sure that you are in the know and certainly engaging with as many people as you can. And talking about engaging, I can already see the great engagement that we're getting on our Facebook page. Fulufelo Hope saying evening Zama Buhle Maduna, also saying evening Zama Gletcherinda's watching, Goso Khumalo's also watching. And of course, many of you who are watching on our Facebook page, do show us some love down there below. And of course, you know that on our Facebook page, we're running an incredible competition that started off with us setting the ambitious goal of wanting to reach 1 million followers on our Facebook page, which we have done thanks to you at home. And of course, we also set out to have 10,000 comments and shares in the post that we've pinned on our Facebook page. We've also exceeded that, and we're now taking it up a notch. We want to have 20,000 comments, and we know we can do this, right? If there are a million of us now, it's over 1 million of us in this family. We know that we can certainly reach and exceed that 20K target that we have set out for ourselves. And you stand a chance at home of walking away with 500 rands in cash when you participate. And all you have to do to claim the money is to be watching us live every single day. Halfway through the show, we're going to announce who the lucky winner is, and you have until the end of the show to raise your hand in order to claim the prize. If the person doesn't claim the prize while we're still on, then it rolls over into the money bag for the following day. Now, yesterday we had two winners. Unfortunately, only one, Semi Mahlatse, whose birthday it also was, claimed the prize. So this evening we've got 1,000 rands in the money bag. So if you know you've entered, you want to wait to see if we are going to call out your name. That's certainly some of what you can look forward to later on the show. And of course, later on this evening, what you can look forward to, as it is a Tuesday, Mbali Nogo bringing you the farming podcast at 8 p.m. And you can also catch her every single Thursdays with the same show, where she always takes us through all things agriculture. It is now spring. Spring has sprung. I'm also doing quite a bit of gardening and growing my own veggie patch, as you've seen on my social media platforms. You can follow me there at Zamantungwa_K. So also getting great tips from Mbali's show about how I can do a better job at it, especially because I want to be able to eat some of the food that I grow. So that certainly is a great show that I'm always plugged into. And of course, every Wednesday is Esty Clarkson takes us through the first time home buyers show, where she's always in conversation with people who've not only walked that first time home buying journey, but have gone on to grow their property portfolios from strength to strength. And Mondays and Fridays, Chad hits us with an amazing preview of incredible properties that you can find on www.privateproperty.co.za. And they're so exquisite. Now, I often say that I wish I could do one of my shows in some of those properties. And I think we'll see. I think we must arrange maybe episode 350, have a small little dunyana in one of the great properties that Chad gets to see. Well, those are the great shows that you can find every single weekday at 8 p.m. across Private Property's social media pages. And of course, do follow us across our social media pages. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok. If there's a social media platform, we are certainly there and catering to all of your property property needs. And talking about those property needs, that actually, leads us to our conversation this evening, which I am very excited about, because this is one of those things that I, follow very closely. Part of my portfolio, some of the businesses I run have an interest in this particular topic. So I always love talking about it. And this evening, we're looking at why you should consider investing in student accommodation. And if you're in the student accommodation market, I want to find out from you, are you an investor that's got whether one or more units in student accommodation? And if you don't, is it something that you're interested in? What is it that you're still unclear about or wary of when it comes to student accommodation as part of your property portfolio? But to help us better get a good sense of, what we should look out for, and even the state of student accommodation right now, I'm joined this evening by Liesl Brits, who's the head of broking at Mid-City Property Group. Liesl, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Zama. Good evening.
Liesl, I think one of the big things before we even look at, do's and don'ts and tips for people who are looking to explore getting into student accommodation and some of the great reasons that I know that you're going to share. I think first, let's just look at an overview of, the state of student accommodation, the state of student accommodation market in South Africa, especially in 2021, given that we're in a pandemic year. I was even saying to you off air that I've spoken to quite a number of different landlords who have student accommodation units from last year, even this year. And obviously, they're all sharing their experience of how they've navigated lockdowns and having to, students leaving. So currently, when we're looking at student accommodation markets, certainly from the area that I know that you're primarily in Pretoria, what would you say the state of, the market is this year?
Yeah, it's true that last year actually was really bad. And I think the biggest thing, the major damage that were caused to the market was the uncertainty. We were so uncertain on when NSFAS would be paying. We were so uncertain on when students would be returning. So that besides the financial damage that a lot of landlords have incurred due to that, but there are also some of the landlords that actually benefited from that, especially if you have a NSFAS accredited building with your Fundi system installed. Most of those landlords actually collected those Fundi cards from the students, and they were actually swiping while sitting watching Netflix. So, and they had empty buildings, and they actually took the opportunity to upgrade their buildings and to actually take the time to make sure that the buildings are ready for the next intake. And I think what has happened with the academic year that was stretched up until end of March this year, if you didn't have the cash flow at the end of last year, it would have been very difficult for you. But this year, the academic year started in April and it's obviously ending in November. So your concentration of money that are coming in now, you can actually cover the loss that you've had. But it is true that a lot of the landlords that have huge cash flow setbacks. But still, for you to consider to get back into the market, we are still not very certain on what's going to happen next year. But what we do know is that the psychological damage for students, and not only even just students, but any employee that are actually working from home now, the psychological damage that are caused are actually long-term so bad, and all the institutions actually realized that it's impossible for a student to actually study from home without support, without fellow students around them. And if we just look at the circumstances that we have in institutions like TUT, those students are actually from rural backgrounds. They do not have electricity, they don't have Wi-Fi, it's not safe for them to actually sit with a laptop that they've been given, granted from government. So they have to return back to campus. They have to come to these off-campus accommodation where they have Wi-Fi, where they have suitable accommodation with furniture and, the support with transport to classes and that. So student accommodation will I think, forever be very, very popular and in demand.
And Lisa, I think one of the big things that and I love that you've highlighted it, is that in as much as a lot of the universities have moved to online learning because of COVID, we also know that students need an environment where they're able to learn. So, the fact that they're no longer going on campus doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't going to be a demand for student accommodation. It may be slightly different. And if anything, perhaps there might even be an instance where with certain universities, we haven't seen that yet. We might perhaps see that in the future where, student enrollment figures increases, because now it's no longer about, having students physically come into class, because capacity was often not only from a staff perspective, but also from a lecture theatre has, 500 seats. Therefore, you cannot suddenly enroll, for example, 1,500 students for a particular program. And I think with certain universities, I know they're even exploring, some kind of hybrid model for the future, where they can also increase the staff complement so that they're able to, deal with the bigger volume of students who are potentially going to access their courses, meaning that we're still going to have a demand for beds. Because one of the things that we knew pre-COVID was that there simply weren't enough university beds in South Africa to cater for the number of students who needed them. And this was even with the residences, the university residences, and of course the private residences. So there was still this huge gap that needed to be filled. And I know that, for example, the Department of Higher Education, always emphasizes those specific numbers when we would have enrollment at the beginning of the year. So it really is one of those pressure issues that was a ticking time bomb in many ways, because we always used to see the long queues with students requiring, student accommodation. And it really is a crisis. I think if anything, what COVID has now allowed us to do is to also just get clear on the kinds of services we need to be providing to students. As you were saying that, it's about the environment, but it's also making sure that they have the right amenities for them to be able to work in the student accommodation versus, for example, if they are at home. I want to find out from you at home, if you're in, student accommodation, how was your student accommodation unit or units affected during COVID, and how did you recover? Because I think one of the great things is, of course, learning from each other and seeing what other people were doing. I know that there's some landlords who, when students went out, they started taking in young professionals for a shorter period because students said, look, we're going home, we don't know what's happening. And with some university, school was suspended for a little bit, and as Lisa already pointed out, the academic calendar kept being stretched and stretched and stretched. But we're also now getting used to, I'll say, life in COVID and having to adapt to it. And so making the decision around going into student accommodation becomes so crucial. So, Lisa, for people who are considering going into student accommodation because they're seeing the potential, they can see that, look, there's a shortage and there are properties on the market that are close to universities or in university towns, as we call it. I think what would first just be the key thing that they need to bear in mind when it comes to student accommodation that would be different from if they were just doing a normal rental, let's say, to a young family or even a young professional?
So I think on a smaller scale, and I always Vusi Tumbawayu's video for the chicken farm, where he actually coaches people that come to get funding, is to start small. And I see that often when potential investors approach us, that they actually want to jump for the really big buildings immediately. And it's actually very dangerous to start off with a massive building and try and, besides the fact that the possibility for you to get funding on a massive building, a commercial building, it's actually good to start with a single residential flat and in a good building close to a university, and just rent that out, just to get into the industry, to start learning about the behavior of students, their needs, the timetables, the fact that you only going to get income for 11 months. What do you do in your 12 month? Some of the university only pays for 10 months. And there's often the uncertainty about, why do we get 11 months versus 10 months? Like UP, normally students come in Feb and they leave in November. So that's a 10-month cycle. Whereas with TUT, they always come in January because they come from rural areas. So they need time. So NSFAS actually also pays them on an 11-month cycle. So that's actually very beneficial for any investor to be paid over 11 months. So you've just got to sacrifice that 1 month and prep then for the next year's intake. But I've got my own properties as well, and you've got the choice to either furnish your properties for your students. The good thing about your single residential flats and taking on students on a small scale is you don't have to adhere to all the red tape that a larger building with, let's say, 100 students or beds minimum. The minute you get your building accredited for NSFAS, then obviously you've got to adhere to all the red tape. You've got to go through the accreditation process. You've got to pay all those fees. You've got to get Wi-Fi in your building. You've got to get security on each floor, and you have to have laundry, transport, all of that. So I've got clients that actually invest in 3-bedroom units, and they place students, like 6 ladies in a flat. They do pay the body corporate a little bit more for the extra water consumption, which I respect a lot. Because in a sense, we'd see 6 adults or students occupying a 3-bedroom flat as overcrowding. So some of these investors are actually very good in terms of collecting an extra 100 Rand for the water and pay that per head and pay that over to the body corporate. And then they furnish the properties. They put a washing machine. Apparently, that's a big draw card for the female students. And they collect 2,500 Rand per bed. So that's pushing the income. You're getting double what a normal in like my properties. I'll get 6.5. Where if you put 4 students, then or 6 students, you get triple that amount, which is actually good. So starting on a small scale to just learn about students and how they behave and their specific needs are actually what I would advise people to do. And I think banks also like to see a portfolio with students that you can prove yourself as a very responsible investor instead of coming in trying to buy a building housing 50 students or 100 students and taking a chance, because this is not a Tatama chance type of industry. You've got to be very risk-free to the banks to consider you as an investor. That why would the bank take a chance on you if they can maybe finance investor with with a lot of experience with specifically student accommodation, because it is a risky industry. Just as the investor himself would be a risk, but also with NSFAS and everything that has happened with COVID is an extreme risk to the banks now, because they have burnt their fingers with certain investors that could not carry themselves throughout this period. So it's as if most investors are actually, we are yearning to get our buildings accredited with NSFAS because it's less risky. But we've seen now, especially with your UP students, that was not the case, that they've left the buildings, we've bled as landlords, and the banks do not want to take that risk. So with commercial properties, where we used to be getting finance on a 70% loan to value, now we are backing to get a 50% loan to value.
I'm this evening in conversation with Liesl Brits, who's the head of broking at Mid-City Property Group, and we're looking at why you should consider investing in student accommodation. I want to find out from you at home, if you're investing in student accommodation, how was it particularly, or rather, how is it, particularly now during COVID? And I mean, it's the second year of us living in COVID, would have had an opportunity to somehow plan for more lockdowns and adjust the way that that you're running your business relative to last year when it, of course, hit us without, any warning whatsoever. We're going to go for a quick break and see who the potential lucky winner of that 1,000 rands this evening for our competition is. I hope they're watching so they can claim their prize. And when we come back, we'll certainly get to the questions, comments. I see all the love that you're showing us on our Facebook page. We'll get to those in just a moment. And the winner this evening goes to Vyasha Naidu. Vyasha Naidu, if you are watching, I hope you're watching, drop us a message down here below to claim your money. 1,000 rands is in the money bag. So you stand a chance of walking away with that 1,000 rands. That's Vyasha Naidu. If you are tuned in, then do make sure that you drop us a message in order to claim your prize. Now, I saw a few new names that gave us some love on our Facebook page earlier on. Adeline Bloem-Pillay is watching. Megan van Skalbeek is also watching. Udumza Asimanye is watching, and of course showing us love on our Facebook page. Rifulwe Malibana, I see you there on Facebook, and of course the regulars who is Verencha Pedachi, as well as Colin Jansen, Fatima Simji, and Rozombele are also watching. Keep the love coming there on our Facebook page. We absolutely love seeing it. And of course, if you are in student accommodation, I want to hear your experience with the student accommodation market, especially this year. Have there been any adjustments that you needed to make to be able to essentially plan for the reality of operating in COVID and knowing that perhaps you may not have as much demand because there were still some students who potentially didn't want to come live in student accommodation places, or parents who didn't want their kids to live in student accommodation places? Or were you one of those landlords? Because I've also heard landlords saying, look, my place stayed 100% occupied. And if anything, even after, full occupancy, I still had students wanting a place and, contacting us, wanting to, get a bed. So if you're one of those, what are you doing right? I think do share with the rest of us so that we can get those notes. Now, Liesl, I think when we then look at, and I love that you've highlighted this, and I want to bring it up, that if you're going or when you go into student accommodation, similarly really to any other kind of property, class that you'll go for, you do want to start small. You don't want to start with a building that's suddenly going to have 50 beds. And you're thinking, oh, I'm going to gross, 200K if I have 50 beds and I'll maybe net 180. These numbers look amazing. In a year, I'll definitely be, nearly a millionaire. Because it doesn't work like that. I think anybody who's managed even one unit understands the value of learning from that one unit. And it can be something as pedantic as putting in systems in place for that one unit, maintenance for that one unit, managing that one unit, and so on. So you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. And I think the fact that Lisa is even pointing out that banks are also now even more wary. So by the time you're wanting to look at 50 units, they do want to get a sense of, have you done this before? They're not going to extend that line of credit to somebody who hasn't even managed, 2 students, for instance. So you really do want to make sure that as you're navigating, wanting to add student accommodation, or perhaps start off with student accommodation, you start off in small sizes, because you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. And now, Lisa, when we even look at biting off more than you can chew, I think one of the big things, of course, there is around finances. And I think people sometimes don't have a sense of how student accommodation can sometimes cost you slightly more in certain areas than perhaps, a normal apartment that you might rent out to, or even a normal house that you might rent out to a family or a young professional. Perhaps just take us through what you should be budgeting for and how you should look at budgeting around when you have student accommodation units.
Sure. Expenses on the one side is something where we just have to bite the bullet, because with student accommodation, you've got the red tape and you've got all the list of requirements, especially if you're going to go specifically, and I'm hammering a lot on TUT specifically. I'm not even looking at UP at this stage because they have a lot of student res available in Hatfield, specifically in Pretoria. So I wouldn't recommend to any newcomer to the industry to specifically go for Hatfield because Hatfield is actually saturated, and we've seen a lot of the students or landlords bleeding there because of the fact that only 25% of the students at UP are actually funded by NSFAS. So that gives you an idea of 75% of those students actually went home and they're studying from home now. So we're not too sure if they're going to return next year. We can't have that guarantee. However, due to the psychological damage, we hope that they do return. But one thing that we do know is that 98% of the students of TUT are actually on NSFAS accreditation, or they get the NSFAS grant. So they have to come back to the student accommodation and the rest off campus here in Pretoria. And we're talking about the areas Arcadia, Sunnyside, Central, Pretoria West. So we are quite certain that they definitely will return. So as I mentioned, you have to prove to the bank that you can sustain the student accommodation and that you will be able to recover and pay your bond. So expenses on the one side is something that we will have to do. So at TUT, it's expected from you as a landlord to provide transport. It's expected to provide Wi-Fi uncapped at a certain speed. It's you have to furnish your apartments and you have to maintain that as well. It's not like you're buying a microwave and it's now there and you don't have to replace it. Students actually break things and students actually use things and they sleep on the beds and you'll have to replace beds. You'll have to pay your insurance. You'll have to, as I mentioned, the transport. So if you're not close to a bus rapid transit route or you can't piggyback on an existing route system, you'll have to get your own buses. You'll have to get insurance on those buses. So it actually accumulates, and we've done the calculation on these expenses. You've got to prep yourself for a minimum of 40% on that income. So at the moment, the income is 4,100 per student for 11 months, and you have to budget for a minimum of a 40% on that. You have to provide electricity, you've got to provide water, you have to provide the laundry services. So we normally put measurements into our own buildings to prevent, obviously students that are going to abuse the system, where they put in too many, their friends come over for a shower, they cook there, they sleep there. So you've got to have a proper system where you control the access to your building. It's also a nice roll call system for the university. So if a student is not clocking in at university, they will come back to you as a landlord to check if the student have actually been to the building, what have they worn last. So you've got to have a CCTV system at your building as well for the safety of the students as well. So you've got a budget for at least a 40%. So your expenses on the one side is one thing, but you can't afford to have vacancies in your building. So we often work with investors through our own buildings to show them, and we actually tell them exactly what mistakes we've made. So we try and teach investors to not make the same mistakes and what to expect more or less in certain buildings. Especially if you've got a mixture of students between different universities, like your UP students don't want to mix with TUT students, whereas your TUT students wouldn't mind mixing with any other institution students. So you've got to prepare yourself for things like that as well. But just back to the vacancies, you cannot afford to have vacancies in your building. And with any business, like if you think how many second-hand car dealerships we've got, if you look at all the salons, we actually the market will never be saturated with salons, but if there's a salon with a better offering with specials or a new product or a new service or whatever, we go for it. I think student accommodation is very sensitive in terms of location, so you'll funny enough find students that don't want to be close to the main TUT campus. They actually want to be in the buzz in Sunnyside, closer to the clubs and that. So, so you wouldn't, I would think that I would want to be close to the main campus where I study. However, the students actually prefer both. You'll have some students that prefer to go into a building with a lot of rules and regulations, and other students actually want buildings where there are no rules and regulations, but you'll also have a high failure rate in that specific building. But I think if you think about the needs of a student, and I mean, I studied at TUT as well a long time ago, and I was fortunate to study on campus. We had a house committee in our building. We had like a house mother and father, like a caretaker in the building. We were close on campus. We had sport activities. We had beauty pageants. We had socials. We had church outreach. Now, if you look at a student accommodation raised off campus, the private accommodations, they actually don't provide that. And if you want to stand out as a landlord, a very successful landlord, without any vacancies, you have to look at what the students on campus are being offered and try and present that in your off-campus building. So if we just look at the connection with on-campus activities like your sport activities, you can maybe partner with other off-campus building landlords and say, let's form a soccer team amongst our buildings, and we provide transport for those boys to go and compete with the on-campus race soccer teams. Let's create a sobriety feeling in our buildings where we create this opportunity for them to actually have their art displayed on the walls. Let's provide a wall for them to take pictures of their social activities so that they create their own alumni, so that they can come back in a few years' time and say, this is what we had. There's my picture. I belong to this family. You can actually be so creative, because how I see the buildings, you have a building full of clients. Let's say you've got a building with 400 students. Those are actually clients that are they are potential car buyers. They are potential first-time bank account clients for a bank. They are potentially taking out a cell phone contract. So you can actually invite these service providers to your building, give them a nice space and a spot when the students are coming in with their gazebo. They can present their products and services, but you want something as a landlord back from them. You're giving them that advertisement. So they can maybe, for all our graduating students, give us free cell phone, or open a bank account with a 5,000 Rand savings account for the bank. That is an amazing opportunity to catch that student at a young age. I've still got my Standard Bank account that I opened at university. I can clearly remember I went to a gazebo and I opened my bank account there. So it's a massive opportunity for service providers to benefit, but it's also for you as a landlord to benefit. Let's say you get Vodacom in. They can sponsor your students' T-shirts and caps with your building's name printed on the back of the shirt, and that's your walking advertisement on campus, to ensure that the students are actually coming back and they feel that they belong. They've got this pride that they in a building with a nice name. So that's the first advice I would give as well. If you've got a big student accommodation building, is change the name, because some of these buildings have the most boring building names, and you can actually give them a nice name like Mazabuka or Majuba or something like that, that's completely more relevant, and paint them different colors for you to stand out. And if you are planning on buying more than one building, give it a signature. Change your signage and make it your signature. Like City Property, all their buildings have the same signature outside. Mid-City's buildings all have the name The Edge. So we'll have Flowers Edge and Festival Edge and Campus Edge. So that makes you stand out as the landlord, and you'll actually attract these students to want to come and stay in your building.
And I think, one of the things is definitely clear, Liesel, is that we're going to have you back on the show to look at student accommodation best practices and even to share some of the mistakes and learnings, I think, as, Mid-City that you've picked up, saying earlier that this is something that you even do for investors who are keen on getting in the market. Because one of the things that we also know about property is we want to all succeed, right? You want the different buildings in the block to also be fully occupied, be run well, as opposed to being vacant and potentially end up being run down. And so really it is in everybody's best interest when, especially if you look at university towns, when as different landlords, we are running our respective, buildings or certainly accommodation units well and servicing our students well. I want to share a quick comment here coming through from Useni Mahlansa on Facebook saying, I'm one of those running private student accommodation. And last year and this year, it has been tough for us. But with the little number of students we are having, it is better to keep our expenses covered till we can go back to normal life. With the number of COVID-19 declining and people getting vaccinated, we have hope for the next year, even though some TVET colleges already saying they will only have 2 semesters. That is only putting us in a very bad condition. And I think, it is one of those things, as Sam put out, that a lot of the landlords are also just wanting to, at the very least, cover their basis. I think student accommodation, it was one of those areas of property where you enjoy very high yields. And I think for many years, landlords have typically have enjoyed higher yields. And now you're having to say, okay, let me at the very least cover my expenses just so I can stay afloat and weather essentially this COVID storm. Liesel, before I let you go this evening, because I know that we've already run out of time, what final tip would you give to somebody who's still considering potentially getting a student accommodation unit, particularly now? So they're probably obviously going to purchase it we'll say for the next year, because it will probably only register, of course, later on in the year. So they've got their eyes set on owning that first student accommodation unit for the new year. What tip can you give to somebody who is still eyeing? So they're not in yet, but they're still considering getting into the student accommodation market.
So I think if you want to go for the big buildings, if you've got the capacity to go for the big buildings, I think you definitely have to put in a lot of effort in your marketing, because in the end, the student can still choose where they want to go and stay. And the intake is normally, and we're expecting it to be in Feb next year as well. So you have already got to start now with your marketing campaigns to get your building out there. So if you're going to go for NSFAS accreditation, the TUT is actually starting, they're opening up for accreditation now in October. So you must be prepared to have your building ready and to have your apartment, your mock-up apartment furnished, so that when those the accreditation team come out to do the accreditation and the inspection, you've got to be ready for that. You can't be caught with your pants on your knees and be too late, because if you miss it this year, you've got to wait until the next year. But marketing is the major thing. You've got to be out there. You've got to make sure that your gazebos are ready for January when they sit there at TUT. You've got to have your online exposure. But that's with anything like that. If you don't have an online presence on social media platforms and that, you can't expect students to actually know about you, because your building, once it's accredited, will go on they've got a new website, TRES, TRES. And then there's the TUTEC Res website as well. But TRES, this is a platform where students can actually comment on your building. They can complain about your building, and they can actually also compliment you as a landlord. So getting your building ready for that website and your social media platforms to get the word of mouth out there, that's certainly one tip that I can give to all landlords out there when you start, to get that fixed from the start. And network with people, network with the SRC, network with the different companies out there. If you're going to start in the industry, learn from whoever has done it, learn from their mistakes, not to burn your fingers, because student accommodation is actually so risky that it can wipe out your complete portfolio if you make mistakes. Because if you've got a big building and your building is not on the TRES website or something like that, you've got a 100% vacancy, and that can floor you as an investor. Start small and do your marketing.
And I think that's such a great note to leave it on. Start small, learn, rather pay your school fees with 1 or 2 units than, biting more than you can chew, and then paying, the kind of tuition you absolutely might probably not even be able to recover from. Lisa, we're going to leave it there this evening. I'm already, calling it. We're definitely going to bring you back on the show later on this year, because we want to be able to get a sense later on in the year on what people who already are in student accommodation should be doing. I mean, you've already highlighted one is that you want to start marketing early. And I know already towards the tail end of the year, it's already a good place to start marketing as early as then, because there are still students who want to confirm their accommodation before they actually, go back home over the December period. And so not everybody is going to be searching for accommodation in January. Some actually want to have already viewed and decided before leaving. So later on in the year, we're definitely going to bring you back to get a sense of what we should be doing in the event where we have student accommodation units to get ready for the new financial year. What should we have in place? And if we don't have it in place now, what are some of the systems that we need to put in place? But for now, we're going to leave it there. Liesl, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Zama. Thanks for the opportunity. Good night.
And that is Liesl Brits, who's the head of broking at Mid-City Property Group, bringing us to the end of this evening's Private Property Podcast with myself, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. Now, the team has let me know that unfortunately, Vyesha Naidu has not claimed the prize, so it will be rolling over tomorrow to 1,500 rands. Remember, if you know you've entered, you want to make sure that you're watching us live, because if you call your name, you have to drop us a text in order to claim that prize. Well, I've overstayed my welcome. You can, of course, look forward to Mbali Nwoko on the Farming Podcast at 8 p.m. I'll be back on your screens tomorrow at 7 p.m. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.